We are not here to curse the darkness. We are here to light a candle. Hello and namaste, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Almost Daily Zencast. It is okay to get up and wiggle around when you listen to the music on this show. That was I Can't Not Dance, a Remix Live digital remix of Acid House 101 by your favorite animatronic DJ from space, DJ Zed. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. It is Sunday, December 13th, 10:37 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That quote I opened with was from JFK. And I think it is as relevant, as important, as significant as it was then, today. Speaking of past presidential precedent, I want to share with you a realization I had recently. I had been thinking that Trump was essentially a modern-day Nixon. And, you know, the parallels are obvious. They're not direct. And Trump doesn't seem to be getting ready to resign and get himself pardoned, which is kind of silly because I would think that in his position, that would make the most sense. Get out, get pardoned, and try to avoid criminal investigations at the state level. But he seems to have other plans. Only time will tell, as he himself is fond of saying. To finish my thought, after some deeper contemplation and some looking back at history, I realize now that I was wrong. It is more accurate to compare Trump to Agnew. Now, some people have forgotten all about Agnew and his little debacle, but he was Nixon's vice president. And that little bit of history is worth digging into. Go check it out, folks. It's interesting. Okay, well, here we are. And wow, what a week, what a month, what a year. But we're almost there, folks. We're almost at the end of 2020, which for some sounds like the greatest thing in the world. But for others, like me, who realize that the, quote, normal of the yesteryear, the ye olde golden times before Trump took a big giant dump in American culture, the normal wasn't all that great. I've rambled about that at length in previous episodes. I won't indulge in that this hot second, but I'm sure we'll come back to discussing the old normal as we transition. Today's theme was change, and I've got to admit to you again, folks, I live for this, right? Like, 2020 has forced me to adjust, to change, and it's been a challenge. It's been not easy. I'm not blessed with a stay-at-home job. I'm not blessed with a job that I could telecommute from, and I'm not getting any help from the federal government. I'm not taking unemployment. I don't think I've ever taken unemployment. And life sucks, if I'm going to be really honest with you. But one of the things that emerges in my consciousness is that change is the only constant. And yet, quite fascinatingly, our society has vilified change. Change is bad, folks. Look at how angry certain sub-segments of the demographics out there are about the idea that some people who live in this country have the right to vote and the right to run for office, that some of these people want to change America. Ooh, evil, evil change. And yet we must confront change every day, every minute, every hour, every week, every month, every year of our lives, because life is change. What are we to do about it? What are we clinging to that we fear change so much? Well, obviously that is a different thing for every individual. I do sympathize with this simple fact. There's so much ridiculous change, most of it kind of meaningless, but topical and attention-grabbing, that it gets exhausting. This, my dear friends, I have said from the beginning, is one of the central tools that Trump enjoys utilizing. He loves to spam his audience's attention with so much garbage, which is, all curiously, mixed in with nuggets of half-truths and mostly true statements, that they become overwhelmed and a bit punch drunk with his madness. As I talked about in a recent episode, those of us who are not under Trump's spell need to step up to a serious spiritual calling in this time of change. First of all, we must, those of us in the resistance, whether we're blue Democrats or purple Democrats or green Democrats, I'm not a Democrat at all, as a matter of fact. I am not registered to any political party, mostly because the system here considers me a toaster oven and not a valid human individual. But that's a whole nother literary fiction world thing. Let's just stick to the real-life facts of your real-life reality as you understand it right here and right now, as I see it from my perspective. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, friends. Forgive me for the broken record moment, but politics is a distraction from real, meaningful, civic organization. And just the past 9 months proves that, in my humble opinion. Let's pause for a moment and transition to the question of the vaccine program. Let's set aside the curious irony that a very large, not the majority, but a large chunk of the Trump base, the coalition that Trump created for himself, a swath of those people are confirmed anti-vaxxers. And yet, Trump betrays them every day that he touts Project or Operation Warp Speed and the new vaccines, which he has very mysteriously implied the military will be handling the distribution of. Well, to the best of my understanding, as of recent reporting that I came across, it turns out, it seems like, and if I'm wrong, forgive me, I don't have the staff to vet everything, so I don't pretend that everything I share with you is absolute truth. Remember that. But according to some of the reporting recently, the military is only actually handling the logistical plan making. And then the responsibility falls to the Postal Service and the postal industries that are participating, and then the local authorities, state by state, county by county. What does that remind you of? Oh, it reminds me personally of the election process here in the United States. Is it perfect? By all means, no. Could it be improved? Of course it can. Are our current politicians trying to make voting the most efficient, the most powerful, the most accessible mechanism of democracy in the United States? I don't see that happening. But I digress. Trump does this to his base all the time, and they seem to just bend over backwards, stick their heads up their own ass in an attempt to rationalize the fuck out of it. He seduced the anti-immigrant crowd, to call them by a polite label, and convinced them, promised them that Mexico, that dirty country, that dirty shithole country down south of us, would pay for the wall. Of course they didn't pay for the wall. All 9 miles of new wall, according to the reporting I can confirm, 9 miles of new wall were built in 4 years. And who paid for that? It wasn't Mexico. It wasn't Canada. It was the good old American taxpayer. Yes, of course, there were several other dozens of miles of repairs and replacements of old fencing, etc. But did he build the grandiose, gleaming wall from coast to coast that he promised us? Of course he didn't. That's what he does. He hires contractors and then stiffs them on the bill. He promises you the world and then pardons himself for not delivering. And it's not just the anti-vaxxers and the immigrant haters that he did this to. The Obama bashing crowd, he promised he would be all the things that Obama wasn't. And yet he golfed more hours of golf in 4 years than Obama did in 8. And he used more executive privilege in 3 years than he said he would, because when Obama did it, it was bad. But I digress. We are facing an incredibly stressful amount of change. Now, we can unburden ourselves of some of this stress load by identifying that which is nonsensical. For the second time in as many weeks, Trump's own hand-picked Supreme Court has resoundingly rejected his alarmingly comical attempts to legally, quote-unquote, overthrow, direct quote from Trump's own tweet feed, the election. Now, I'm not attributing that terminology to him. He has overtly spoken of overthrowing the election. That's one of the most categorically un-American things that an American president has ever said. And I'm not even a big fan of American ideology and of American... I mean, I love America, don't get me wrong. I've talked about this on the show before, and I'll talk about it again, because I don't want to be accused of being an America hater. I love this place, I love this land, and I love these people. What I don't like is the absurdity in its politics. What I don't like is that people wrapped up in political ideology believe that politics is worth dying and killing for. In my humble opinion, no politician, no political ideology is worth that level of self-destruction. Now, tragically, one of the socially conditioned ideological constructs that long predates Trump, because as I've said before, from the very earliest days of my podcast, Trump is a symptomology, not a cause of the problem. Now, one of this ideology I was referring to that predates Trump is the irrational belief based on neurolinguistic social conditioning that violence is a tool that solves problems. Forgive me for pointing out that 5,000 years worth of your human history clearly indicates that violence achieves only one thing: the propagation of more violence. Actually, let me correct that statement. It provides only two things: the propagation of more violence and absurd profit to those who profiteer on that violence. And I assure you, my friends, the profiteers don't care where the violence happens. They don't care if it happens in some third world country as a proxy war or if it goes down on the streets of your hometown. They sold all the guns and ammo that is being used in all the violence. They only care about the profit. But I digress, because we're talking about change, and we're talking about the changes we're going through here and now. We must, as a society, as a community of communities, build consensus about what change is reasonable, what change is desirable, and what change is a waste of our time. We should not allow ourselves to be manipulated to fear change. In my humble opinion, we must stare change down face to face, eyeball to eyeball, and master it, not through oppression or destruction of others, but through self-actualization. On that note, friends, I've been rambling enough. It's time to hand it over to DJ Zed for another bit of electronically remixed danceable music. This is an Electro 101 remix live track entitled Dance the Year Away. DJ Zed. let's turn our attention to this vaccination situation. Understanding the position expressed by anti-vaxxers, which I don't completely 100% agree with, and understanding the position of those who could be labeled pro-vaxxers, again, I don't 100% agree with them. I find myself standing between these two extremes, somewhere in the middle. Now, the anti-vaxxer argument is complex and is riddled with some bordering on irrational anti-scientific conspiracy theory manipulation. The pro-vaxxer position is flawed because it's a bit too much blind faith adherence to entities that report according to scientific guidelines. What do I mean by all that? Well, from a top-down view, let's take a big bird's eye perspective. Historically speaking, vaccinations are not cures. Now, this is something that I think both sides of this issue often conflate or confuse or don't quite understand or have been misled to misunderstand. There's a lot of people wearing masks who hope that as soon as they get a vaccine, they can stop wearing masks. That's not going to be the case for a bunch of reasons, and we can discuss them in a hot second. There's people over on the anti-vaxxers side that refuse all science imaginable, but that's pretty unpractical. Think about it. Let's pause here for a second and take a little bit of a dive into the anti-science position. People who are up in arms about science have varying degrees of perspectives on it. Some people are closer to my position in the middle, which is to say that science has a corruption problem. It's visible, it's understandable, it's common in human endeavors that deal with large amounts of money and power. But it is not a reason to categorically reject all science. There are some anti-science, anti-vaxxer types out there that speak as though they are prepared to reject all science, and yet they're spending their days on computers, which were built, designed, engineered, and produced by science, expressing these anti-science views on social media platforms, which without science, they wouldn't exist, and then get in their cars, which, again, science developed, to go places and transact in business activities, all of which would be nearly impossible by today's standards of comfort, safety, and security and convenience without science. I don't want to disrespect science deniers and anti-science folks, right? Like, you're entitled to your opinion. And there's certainly problems with, quote, science at all. I'm not saying that science and all scientists are fucking saints. Nobody's a fucking saint. Are you a fucking saint? I highly doubt it. Even if you're a wonderful human being. Truly serious anti-sciencers should get off the internet, stop using ballpoint pens, stop wearing clothes manufactured in post-industrial manufacturing techniques, and, no longer drive to their preferred locations to conduct any kind of financial transaction that requires science. Now, there are some folks out there living off the land in the woods using very minimal science, and huzzah for them. I don't have a beef with the people who have allowed their suspicion of science to explode into a full-on paranoia. I'm concerned for their well-being. But I also challenge them to be really true to their word. If you hate science so much, get rid of it from your life. Good luck with that, though, because you're fucking surrounded by it. Conversely, I am not one of these people badgering anybody who has any question in their mind about questioning science. In fact, I support and endorse questioning everything. Question the science. Question the institutions. Question the individuals involved. But do not be seduced into blindly vilifying them all irrationally. And do not be seduced to blind faith adherence to them all irrationally. Both extremes are absurd and I don't want to say self-destructive, but ultimately, yeah, they're kind of self-destructive. We must all, as a collective of human beings, meet in the middle on issues like that. We cannot allow ourselves to be led by the nose to such degrees of division, such degrees of animosity towards our friends and neighbors. That's what I got to say about the current situation. That and the following. These new vaccines that are coming out are preceded by buttloads and buttloads of fear-mongering, psychologically manipulative content, encouraging people to flat out reject them blindly. I don't know that that's going to help as much, presuming that COVID-19 is a real thing, right? It is not impossible that it's completely made up. Plenty of people out there, I see on social media, are posting such interesting statements as, I'm not washing my hands, I'm not doing any of the hygiene, I'm running around with my freedom and hugging everybody. Good for you. You're very lucky. Meanwhile, nearly 300,000 American families have reportedly lost loved ones. Now, some people just plain old don't give a fuck. In fact, that's a really strong, powerful American ideal, the I give no fucks, the no fucks given mentality. Something that America takes great pride in. But as I've said before on the show, perhaps, dare I question this mentality, this attitude, perhaps not giving a fuck may have contributed to our collective clusterfuck situation that we find ourselves in. Just maybe. Just throwing that out there. Maybe, just maybe, we are actually called to give a fuck about ourselves, about each other, about the greater good, about, everyone, including those deeply corrupted and abusing their power. I saw recently a post by an acquaintance of mine who's generally speaking on the spiritual side of things, who was criticizing what he perceived as a new trend of spiritual people talking about self-sacrifice. And this individual argued that self-sacrifice is flawed and that actually isn't a spiritual virtue. My response was, depends on how you define self-sacrifice. There are some things that abusers and abusive mentality throw out there, labeled self-sacrifice, which are indeed redonkulously toxic and not helpful to anyone. But there is also compassion-based, giving a fuck type self-sacrifice. And when the situation is right and the context is right, I believe that kind of self-confidence is spiritually powerful. Did I say self-confidence? I meant self-sacrifice. That kind of self-sacrifice is powerful. There's also a lot of bizarre, violence-oriented obsession with self-sacrifice. There are people out there who say they'd rather die than endure the tyranny of putting up with risk reduction measures, right? And again, I find myself caught between two extremes. There's the extreme of lock everything down and fuck all you science deniers. I can't agree with that extreme, in large part because so far I don't see that kind of thinking giving us the best possible set of solutions. There's also the opposite extreme, which I've already identified. The people who are running around saying, fuck you all, my freedom comes first, I don't give a shit about who dies, I don't give a shit if I die. And I can relate to that. I am an individual that has spent a lot of time contemplating my mortality and evaluating how I should feel about it. And I fancy myself someone who does not fear death. I acknowledge that I can't help but have a mild knee-jerk fear of the pain that might be involved given the ways in which one might die. But the actual going through the transformation of abdicating this embodiment, that itself does not concern me too much. I guess somewhere deep down in there's a little bit of fear that the Middle Ages, Dark Ages interpretation of the afterlife might be the realist. But that's also extremely irrational. It doesn't make sense. But, I mean, not just my fear of it, but the construct, the ideological mapping of what, the afterlife was like as inspired by Dark Ages, Medieval Ages, Catholicism, which at that point basically ruled the world. But when it comes to this accusation of living in fear, there's a huge irony there. There's a lot of people spewing hate speech and perpetuating fear-mongering content at the, quote, sheeple for living in fear. And yet it's the conspiracy theory peddlers that are freaking out about 5G, about vaccines, about brainwashing, etc., etc. Who's living in fear then? It's a deep hypocrisy to accuse others of living in fear and yet be deeply involved, like balls deep involved in perpetuating fear-mongering content. When one does that, one is actually expressing one's own fears. I've talked about that on the show before too, so I won't linger on that thought. But there's so much going on in this massive chaos right now. From this argumentation about the vaccine, very similar sort of chaos around the testing regime. And I find it really interesting that everyone who's opposing getting tested, they're all parroting the same talking points about one format, which is admittedly by the mainstream media and by the people who create it and use it, flawed, not the best testing format. Curiously, though, there are multiple forms of testing out there. The fear-mongering propaganda focuses on this one particular form, which the people administrating it will tell you it's like not the most reliable, but it's what was available at the time, and it's in the largest enough quantities to get going, right? And we have emphasized other forms of testing. New testing kits are available, but using completely different, technologies. There are people, reportedly, according to some reporting, that still deny the very existence of this disease. I was referencing earlier people who are posting on social media that it must be a hoax because they aren't experiencing it. We gotta call that out, friends, because that's like saying I've never encountered racism, so it must all be a lie, or I've never caught cancer, so it must be a hoax. Or I've never been pregnant, so babies must not exist. What? Just because you have not encountered a thing does not automatically prove that it doesn't exist. I've never been to North Korea. I have been to South Korea, though. So, should I run around saying that North Korea is a lie? Because all I saw was South Korea? Of course not. It's ridiculous. Trump himself modeled this behavior, and this is how cults of personality work, right? It's almost irrelevant if the cult leader doubles back and starts promoting other things, because he's already indoctrinated the base enough that they'll just do mind gymnastics to rationalize it all. The COVID deniers should be furious with Trump. He's the one who empowered them to believe it was all a hoax, that it doesn't exist, that it's not real. And now he's patting himself on the back for Operation Warp Speed, right? Crazy. Now, I didn't want to make this episode all about COVID. We were talking about change. Change is an issue that's larger than the immediate context we find ourselves in, because it's literally one of the only constants in the universe, right? Even the large, imposing, enduring things in the cosmos, like stars and galaxies, they are all perpetually changing, although admittedly in probably mind-bogglingly large timescales. We must address this fear of change, because if we don't, we will constantly be bickering, arguing, and fighting amongst ourselves about how to navigate new circumstances and how to implement new change. And I know that lots of Americans love the country as they understand it and don't comprehend, can't even imagine why anyone else would want it to change. But that's entirely because of the individual experience of the people involved, right? Those who resist change in American/Trumptopian culture are comfortable and complacent. That's the word I was looking for. They're comfortable and complacent by the convenience they are surrounded by, and they cannot even imagine the circumstances that exist in their own country that other people are going through, which do not match those experiences they've had. Just because you've never lived paycheck to paycheck doesn't mean anyone else out there experiencing that is a liar. Just because you've never been forced to sit in line at a food bank to secure food for your family does not mean that everybody who's doing so is a lazy bastard trying to get a free handout. This is how communities, populations, nations are manipulated. By engaging and indulging in the ego trap of out of sight, out of mind, it's not my experience, therefore it doesn't matter, and the vilification, objectification, and otherification of anyone who disagrees. Now, Trump didn't invent this, but he certainly has taken all of those tool sets and utilized them in a way that has elevated, divide, distract, and conquer to new heights of absurdity. As always, friends, it's worth reminding anyone listening, especially if you're new to the show, I am not a blind faith leftist. I'm in the middle somewhere. And I'm not even a centrist. It's interesting how both the left and the right agree, it's one of the few things they agree on, that somehow centrists are all dead wrong. Somehow the American way must be of extremism, despite the fact that we traditionally fight extremism in other cultures. So many thoughts, so many loose ends. Oh, I wanted to wrap something up about the vaccine issue. As we move forward, pro-vaxxers have to understand that this is not a cure, and that a week from now, the pandemic will not magically be over. In fact, here's one of the things I want to drill down in really quickly, because I don't understand the anti-vaxxer position either, right? The anti-vaxxers are convinced and are really busy perpetuating fear-based, neurolinguistically riddled, manipulative content that insists on the claim that the only absolute truth about vaccines is that they are somehow, this new one particularly, part of a nefarious plan to, cull the population, to control the world, etc., etc., etc. All the different conflicting nefarious plans behind the initial statement that the vaccine should be avoided. If this vaccine in particular is the end game of this master planned nefarious epic decades-long trajectory that was created and, planned out by the evil cabal, why the bloody fuck are the current numbers so shitty? They just, today, I believe, in America, I can't speak for the rest of the world. I do know that in England, in Britannia, as they sometimes like to call themselves, the first Britons started receiving the vaccine a few days ago, right? And today in America, 3 million doses are being urgently distributed. There are 300 million people in America. For, as the theory goes, 4 vaccinations, which are not a cure, they are not a prophylactic, they are a risk reduction measure. For them to work, for any vaccine to work, you need vaccinations, the act of injecting the substances into people's bodies, to reach a minimum threshold of 70 some odd percentage, right? So they made 3 million doses, and that's the best they've got? And even the most ambitious timelines put the nationwide distribution as far out as March, maybe April. This is laughable, my friends. This is evidence of incompetence, of corruption, of meddling on Trump's administration part, right? But it does not spell to me well-organized, nefarious plan to achieve a specific goal by a specific time. I could be wrong. I hope I'm not. And I want to clarify for folks who haven't heard me say this before, because I've noticed there's some new listeners joining the audience. Hey, folks, thanks for joining. Thank you for supporting the show. I am not denying that corruption exists. I am not denying that there are powerful vested interests of various kinds, nationally and internationally, that love to play games that manipulate politics and politicians. What I am questioning is the conspiracy theory content, because after 30 years, and yes, for those of you who are curious enough to do the math, I started really young. And that doesn't mean my experience is invalid. But for 30 years, I have been observing conspiracy theory content, right? And I have been doing the one thing that the conspiracy theory community really has a strange predilection towards rejecting and getting triggered and offended by, which is questioning the content itself. It is my humble opinion, my rational conclusion, that conspiracy theory content is in fact, if not authored by, at least encouraged and managed, subtly manipulated by the conspiracy. Because it is easier, it is more cost effective, it is cheaper and simpler to create concepts that people live in fear of and that people judge other people about, like Agenda 21, Agenda 22, Agenda 20, Agenda 30, because there's apparently dozens of agendas and they sometimes sound like they're all interrelated, but they sometimes don't. It's easier to get people caught up in believing ideological constructs and fearing others about them and hating others about them than actually building the technical infrastructure necessary to achieve those things. My favorite example is that back in the 90s, it was an old gag. That gag had whiskers on it, that FEMA was going to kill us all. I'm talking 1993, I heard this. From people who were convinced it's 2020. The only thing FEMA has done in all of that intervening time is help people after hurricanes and other natural disasters. Now, does that mean I blindly believe that everyone at FEMA is a saint? Of course not. That's laughable. My whole point is we should not think in such polarized, extremist thinking. Reality does not exist in those heightened extremes of ideological and often irrational constructs. Reality exists somewhere in the middle, and that's not even the right place. It's somewhere beyond those things, right? But I digress. I've been rambling long enough, and I'm, committed to keeping my shows under an hour and striving towards creating shows that are even shorter so that you can consume them without dreading the time length. Dear friends, I'll wrap up on this thought for this morning's segment. Change is not to be vilified. Your fellow human beings are not to be vilified. And violence isn't the solution. If you can agree on those things, then we, together, can create a new model of civic organization that takes the best from our existing model and exposes the worst in order to cleanse it away. It is my humble opinion, my friends, and this is serious. This is like deep in the core of why I do this. The system wants our violence. The system wants the Trump base to get violent against the Biden base. The system wants the Biden base to get violent against the Trump base. The system wants you to be seduced by violence and to act on that. What the system fears is metaphysical, species-wide, third eye opening, transformational, spiritual healing. Because if we, as a collective, turned our attention away from their manipulative content and focused on that, they would lose all the power they think they have. Remember, power is virtual. Power does not exist in reality. Power is something human beings imagined and made up and now have turned toxic. Let's take away their power by doing the one thing that the system of oppression has vilified, objected to, marginalized, ostracized, rejected, and tried to convince you not to do, which is achieve metaphysical, species-wide, third eye-opening, transformational, spiritual healing. And you don't need a guru, you don't need a priest, you don't need someone telling you what to believe to achieve that. In fact, my friends, my research indicates that you need the exact opposite of all those things. You need to abdicate all political ideology. You don't need to judge it. You don't need to get angry about it. You need to realize it's political ideology and set it down with compassion and forgiveness. And then you need to look deep within. And that is intimidating hard work for a lot of reasons, which we will put a pin in right there, put it up on the board, and come back and talk about in a future episode. As always, friends, thank you. By tuning in and listening, you are helping me transition, adapt, and change in order to survive the end of 2020 and be better suited to thrive in 2021. This podcast, although originally designed as a sort of hobby for me to just get a little bit of self-expression out on the weekends, has become, through some challenging change of my perspective, my most viable option for a future that is sustainable until better options come along. So, my deepest, most sincerest thanks for tuning in and listening. And if you appreciate what I talk about on this show, please, please, please do come on down to my social media. At Mr. Zeppo, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the big three. And of course, Sprecher.com, where you can interact with the show on its home platform. Of course, the show is available on dozens of fine podcast applications. Namaste, dear friends and internet fam. May peace, love, and grooviness be with you. And until next time. I just said that backwards. I'm out. remember, folks, healing is the solution. Violence is not.